All right. Hello and welcome to the latest installment of Helix Education's webinar series on COVID-19, the roadmap to fall 2020. Today's topic is crisis communication as it relates to student and parent expectation management. Thanks to everybody who's joined us today. My name is Sparky Mortimer. I'm the Associate Director of Creative Strategy at Helix Education, and I'll be moderating our discussion today. So just a couple quick housekeeping items before we get started. If you've joined us for previous webinars, you know the routine. For those of you that haven't, just some ground rules for today. We are recording today's webinar. It'll be posted on Helix Education's YouTube channel later today. And we'll send out a link to all attendees so you can watch that on demand. We're also using a service called Otter AI that's taking a live transcription of our webinar. And so there's a link in the chat to that if you would like to take advantage of that service. We will be taking questions. We've already gotten a lot of questions in advance of the webinar, so thanks to everybody who has submitted questions today. At any time during the webinar, if you have additional questions you would like answered, check out that Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Type your question using that feature, and then we will get to it later on in the webinar today. So with that, just a reminder that, like I said, this is part of a webinar series. We'll talk more about this at the end, but Helix Education, as we are helping colleges and universities accelerate their transition to a quality online learning experience for fall 2020. It's centered around these 4 pillars of quality online education. And today, the pillar we're focused on is student and parent expectation management. And our 2 presenters today are great folks to talk about this topic. We are very pleased to have joining with us from Brenau University, one of our Helix partner institutions, Dr. Juli Clay. She's Associate Vice President of Executive Programs and the Chair of Brenau's Communication Department. If you could sum up Juli in one word, I think it would be driven. Very enthusiastic lifelong learner. She spent nearly 14 years at Brenau facilitating meaningful discussions across audiences, diverse backgrounds, great commitment, great drive, and not just in the higher ed space, but in all facets of her life. High energy, very smart. Her personal goal is to visit every national park in the country. Last summer, I heard she took a van trip all the way from Georgia, where she lives, up to Alaska and back again. So if that doesn't say adventurous, driven, excited, I don't know what it means. I don't know what else you could say about that. And also, I should also call her councilwoman, as Juli is on the Gainesville, Georgia City Council. She was elected last November and has been serving since January. So Juli, thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to hearing from you. Also joining us on the Helix Education side is our COO, Kari Kovar. She's a higher ed lifer. She's another one who's got high energy, really driven. She's also a parent of college students. And so in addition to her professional experience, having been in higher ed for now 2+ decades, she can also offer that perspective of being a parent and what a crisis communication plan can do to serve parents and help them to feel at ease while their children are at an institution. And so 2 great ladies, very driven ladies, very intelligent ladies that I'm excited to hear from today. So Kari, I'm going to turn the time over to you to get us started on crisis communication.
Awesome. Thank you, Sparky. And Juli, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me. This will be a lot of fun.
This will be fun. So for those of you that are also joining us, welcome. We're thrilled to have you this afternoon or morning, depending on where you are kind of in the States. We really are going to treat this as a conversation. We're going to treat this as an opportunity to kind of share lessons learned and to kind of talk through all that's happening around us in 2020, which an adventurous year it has been. And the role of crisis communication, I think, is a pretty important one, given, again, all the things that are kind of coming at us at a pretty quick clip and pace. So these are the questions that we're going to talk through and that we'll have some answers for and or some additional kind of questions that will likely come out of these. And this is really going to be the structure of the next 45 minutes or so. And then as Sparky mentioned, we'll have about 15-20 minutes at the end for you all to ask additional questions. So please feel free to add those into the chat, and then we'll kind of try and move and groove throughout the time. We want this to be very much a conversation. I've had the opportunity to know Juli for a number of years, and I'm thrilled to kind of have her be a part of the discussion, because I think there's great kind of information for us to share and kind of learn together, and to also brainstorm a little bit as we kind of go. I think this quote is a great one. The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in the moments of comfort, but where he stands in the times of challenge and controversy. And I think one of the things that we have certainly seen with COVID-19, and as we think about the fall 2020 and a lot of kind of the unrest that is happening around us, is that this is a time for us to kind of rise up and to think differently and to challenge ourselves and to be able to kind of navigate and manage with a level of care and grace as we kind of go into the fall and into 2021. So with that being said, let's get to the first question, shall we? Which is, again, kind of an easy one, or I guess the main point of the whole conversation, which is, why is crisis communication planning important? So Juli, give us kind of your thoughts on why we should care about this, and why is it a plan an important thing for an institution?
Absolutely. So a crisis communication plan is always critical for an organization to have, because of the things that are listed here on the screen. It gives us a framework to respond effectively and to respond quickly when something comes at us, right? In 2020, we've had a lot come at us. So it allows us to take a step back and to put into place a thoughtful plan that we were able to create when we weren't in crisis mode, right? We don't want to appear like we are just reacting or that we're panicking, because all of our stakeholders are going to be looking at us for that sense of calm and for that sense of organization. And so if we have that plan in place, although we can't predict everything, 2020 has proven that, we can't predict everything, it gives us a framework from which to work. And especially right now, our students are looking to us for that communication. So a survey just came out actually this morning, and over 6,000 students were polled about the communication that they had received from the colleges that they would be attending in the fall. And for the most part, nearly 70% of the students that responded that the communication was favorable. And the reason that they responded when they were asked, why do you think this, was because it was consistent, because it was immediate, because it was adaptive, it showed care, it was transparent, it didn't show panic. And these are all the things that we're able to do if we have a really well-established plan in place before we're slapped in the face with the crisis. So as you can see, some of the things that it allows us to do, it allows us to be proactive. We don't have that delay when the crisis occurs. We already have some initial messaging that we can use. It allows us to kind of triage possible crises so that we don't treat all of them with the same level of excitement, right? Some you can take a step back. And so it allows us ahead of time to decide what are our level 1 crises, what are our level 2 crises, and how do we want to respond to that? It allows us to very clearly identify who our audience is. And we have a lot of different stakeholders, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, but different stakeholders need to be communicated with in different ways. So we're not going to send the same message to our students as we do to the faculty at our institution, right? They're looking for different pieces of information. And so this allows us to know who our audience is and who our stakeholders are. The worst thing we can do is leave out a group of people, right, or overlook somebody. It helps us to know who needs to be involved, both in the planning process and the implementation process, so that we have that team. I'll call them our crisis management task force, right, our crisis task force. It allows us to know who's doing what so that nothing falls through the cracks. And then it allows us an opportunity to kind of do some role playing, right, some testing. Mm-hmm. So it's great if you have a plan. If you've never tested it, you have no idea if it's going to work or not when the crisis occurs. And so it allows us some framework to kind of play with that information.
Awesome. So let's kind of jump into that, right? Let's talk a little bit about more. We talked about kind of the importance of a plan, right? And what it gives us, but what does it give the institution? If you kind of think a little bit further down, right? What does it really what does the institution get out of it?
Yeah, so I think there's really three major things that an institution benefits from when they have a meaningful crisis management plan in place. It gives us flexibility, immediacy, and security. Okay, so flexibility. We can't predict everything that's going to happen, but if we have a foundational response, if we have an idea of what we want to do, we know the value that we want to support from our institution. We know who needs to be involved. We know which media outlets we work with. Then it gives us an opportunity to then just tweak and adapt that plan based on the crisis. So it gives us some flexibility. It allows us to pivot when we need to pivot. It gives us immediacy. People want information immediately. People have wanted information immediately since the beginning of time. Unfortunately, now that is so heightened because we have access to information 24 hours a day. So we have lost the ability to hold off until tomorrow's newspaper to get a message out, right? People want it immediately through social media, through emails, through these other formats. And so if we've got some placeholder statements that we can use, or we have some framework of communication, and we know who we need to contact, we can get messages out immediately. Most people say within a crisis, your audience is looking for some communication within an hour of that crisis occurring. So you don't have time to gather a team together and say, Kari, what do you think we should say about this? And who do we need to call? And where's that email distribution list? So having those things in place allows us to react very quickly and in a meaningful way. And then security. Again, we don't want anything to fall through the cracks. So this plan gives us a clearly defined group of people that have clearly defined roles and responsibilities. And so we can have some assurance, some security that all of those things that need to be done are done. It also gives us some legal security, right? Because if we've taken some of those messages through our legal counsel ahead of time, we know those things that we are allowed to say, those things that might put us into risk for future litigation. And so it gives us some security in those ways as well.
That's awesome. Julie, can I ask another question? Go back to flexibility, right? So in that kind of pillar, if you will, you talk about how the actual crisis more than often doesn't match kind of the scenarios that you play out. How do you manage that? So how do you kind of plan for that, or what do we need to be considering when we think about that, when we can't always have direct alignment with an actual crisis?
Absolutely. And we'll talk some more about kind of identifying potential crises and how we know what we need to plan for. But again, it goes back to having some foundation. So having that team in place, having thought through what are potential crises, what could we predict, right? There's certain things that other schools have already experienced. So we know that there are possibilities, right? We know that we could have an active shooter on campus. We know that there could be a fire or a natural disaster. There's certain things we know. Now, we weren't planning a 9/11. We weren't planning COVID, but we've been through swine flu and avian flu and TB outbreaks. So even though we might not know exactly what the crisis looks like, we know there's a potential to have a medical crisis, right? And so what is our plan of implementation if that happens? We know there's a potential that we have to shut a building down because the roof leaks or because there's a fire. Okay, so how do we replace those students that have been displaced? So we might not know the scale or the severity of a certain crisis, but we can predict certain consequences of a crisis and have a plan in place to handle those. More importantly, we have a plan in place with who and how to communicate. And that's really what people are looking for in the immediate time after a crisis, is that communication. So if we have that audience list, if we have the distribution list and the contact information, we're already way ahead of the curve.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I think that's so true, right? And I think this next quote, I love it. The secret of crisis management is not good versus bad. It's preventing the bad from getting worse. And I think that's a huge part of what we're seeing. And as Sparky mentioned at kind of the beginning of this, I look at, I've got kids that are in college, rising seniors, looking at colleges and universities. And I'm glad to hear that 70% of students are feeling as though they're getting the right information. But I can also tell you that there's a whole bunch of students and parents parents that are feeling like they're not, right? And so that absence of information and or that vacuum is a bit of a challenge too. So let's talk about kind of the next question, right? Which is, how do you actually go about developing a plan?
So a couple of quick things. First of all, people can be paralyzed by the thought of creating a plan if it's not something that they've done frequently or something that they're used to doing. And so the very first thing I would say is don't be paralyzed. There are a million templates. You can just type into Google crisis management templates, and you are going to be overwhelmed with possible outlines that you can use that are really plug and play. Because a lot of the information that you're going to use is going to be consistent whether you're a college, whether you're a business, whether you're a nonprofit. A lot of the information is going to be very consistent. And so I would say don't not do a crisis plan. Don't not develop a plan because you're nervous that you don't know what you're doing. Start by looking at those templates and borrow that information. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel. Now, you'll have to obviously customize them for your institution. So, for example, you need to ask questions like, do we have multiple campuses? How would that be affected? Do we teach in multiple platforms? How is that going to tweak our plan? So you need to ask questions as you're aligning it with your institution, but you can borrow those templates that are there. So things to think about as you are creating your plan, and I like to put them in the form of a question because I think it's more actionable when there's a question. So think about, what is the goal? Is your goal to ensure that you mitigate legal consequences, right? Is that the main focus of your plan? Is it to ensure that your stakeholders feel valued and feel that they've been communicated with? What is the goal of your plan? So you need to kind of understand that because that's going to guide where you go from there. You need to think through who the stakeholders are. We talked through that just a little bit earlier, but you need to really think with some breadth on that question because we can get very focused on our faculty, staff, students, right? And we can think those are our only stakeholders. But most institutions are situated within a community, right? So how does something that happens at our institution affect the community in which our institution is located? How are parents involved? How are trustees involved? Donors, alums? So you really need to think through who those stakeholders are. And as you're beginning to think through that, also think through how they prefer to be communicated with. So for example, at our institution, most of our donor base is a little bit older. They're probably not on Twitter. That's not going to be, or on TikTok or Snapchat. Those aren't going to be good places to reach that particular stakeholder group, right? But our students, on the other hand, are not on Facebook anymore. As my children tell me all the time, it's only for old people. So we're probably not going to reach our 18, 19, 20-year-olds on Facebook. So how do we need to send messages out to them? So we need to really think through not just what are the groups, but who these people are in these various stakeholder groups. What is the communication hierarchy? We'll talk about that a little bit more, but where does the communication need to originate? Who needs to be the spokesperson for messages going out, and how does that need to be distributed throughout our organization, right? So at most institutions, it really should be coming from the president of the college or the university, because that's who people look to as the leader of that organization. Some organizations have a spokesperson, right? A key person from their communication or public relations office. That's fine, but we need to define who that person is, and that's where our communication should come from, so that we have one singular united voice for our organization. Who's responsible for creating messaging? We need to think through that. What are possible scenarios? And we'll talk about these more as well. What are potential risks? So I can come up with a plan. I need to know that not every plan is going to work perfectly, right? Things can happen, and there's no plan that comes without risk. So we need to go ahead and think through what are some possible risks from this plan that I'm going to put into place, and how can I already mitigate some of those possibilities? What are some guidelines for media messaging and, more importantly, media monitoring, especially in our world of social media, right? Where there's instant messaging and where there's less control over that messaging. And then how are we going to assess and evaluate our plan? Because we always need to be looking to continuously improve the quality of our plans. So how can we do that once the crisis is over?
Yeah. So, Julie, will you jump back to that media monitoring a little bit, right? I mean, that's a bit of a wildcat, isn't it? So talk to us a little bit more about what media monitoring really means and what it looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. So, 30 years ago, pretty much most of our media was controlled media. We put a message out, that's what ran. It was either an interview, it was a press release to a newspaper, and they ran it, right? And so there was not a back and forth of information, and other people couldn't contribute to the message. With social media now, we can control that initial post, we can control that initial message, but we don't have control with how people interact with that message, so comments that people put, and information that other people initiate, right? So if you've had a bad experience, you can say anything you want on social media. It doesn't have to be fact-checked. We notice that all the time when we're on social media, right? It doesn't have to be fact-checked, and it sits out there. And when people don't see a differing message, they immediately take that as truth, okay? They fill the void with whatever information they can find. And so we've got to make sure that we've identified somebody in our organization whose job it is to be monitoring those social media platforms, looking for our institution to be named, so that they can dispel any rumors that have been offered. They can handle any, we'll call them micro crises that might come up, right? Somebody going on to complain about something, somebody going on with something negative. Somebody needs to be there to address that, to handle that person's concern and mitigate the future risk of that message. And then also to be monitoring questions, to be monitoring concerns, because sometimes it's just that we need to put more information out, right? There's a lot of questions coming up about something. That gives us an opportunity to know when we need to be responding with additional information or additional communication. So it's really important because it's such an uncontrolled media platform that we have that constant monitoring happening.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so true. I mean, you can see it just kind of spin and move in all these different directions if you're not staying ahead of it or at least engaging with it, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So we've talked about kind of how to get to a plan, and you had mentioned this earlier, but let's dive in a little bit deeper into kind of the stages of a crisis and what does that look like and how should we be thinking about that?
Absolutely. So all of those questions that we just asked, those questions need to be asked long before a crisis occurs, right? And so we think of crises happening in kind of 3 stages or 3 parts. We have a pre-crisis time, right? All of those wonderful days before February 2020. We have the crisis, right? When we're in the thick of it. This is not when we want to have to create something. This is not when we want to have to use our energy to come up with some critical, creative messaging, because we need to survive in the crisis, right? So as much as we can have already done needs to be done before the crisis. And then we have the third section, which is the post-crisis. It's the aftermath, right? And the aftermath gives us an opportunity to really assess and evaluate what we did. What worked, what didn't work, what do we need to tweak, and what do we need to update so that we don't make those same mistakes again and we have a smoother time in the next crisis. So in pre-crisis, that's when we develop that plan that we just talked about. This is when we not just say, oh, these are the types of people we would like on our team. This is where we specifically enroll them on the team. Kari, you are in charge of creating the social media boilerplate messages, right? So you assign specific tasks to specific people and you train them, right? You don't just assume they know what they're doing, but you go through training. This is especially important for anyone that's going to be dealing with the media, because they are going to be put in a constant situation where it's their face, where they're the voice of the institution. So you have to train them. This is where you practice, okay? So a plan is great, But a plan on the shelf that's never tested is just that. It's a plan. We've got to test it. We've got to be able to look for the holes, look for the flaws before we're in a time of crisis. And this is when we review everything with our legal department, our public relations department. We make sure that we're not putting ourselves into any greater risk through our plan.
Whoops, sorry, it helps to unmute myself, right? Tell me a little bit. So one of the things, and again, I'd be curious on your perspective, because again, when we've done this in the past, we always say you need to do this on an annual basis, right? On an annual basis, you need to be kind of testing and trying and going through this process. But given all that 2020 has offered us and the opportunities that it's provided, do you have any thoughts and recommendations on kind of frequency related to kind of your planning and or at least your evaluation of the plan?
Absolutely. So assuming you don't have any crises, wouldn't those be nice days, right? I think you could probably stick to an annual review of your plans. But they need to be evaluated and assessed every time there's a crisis. So as soon as we get to an end, whenever that may be, right, of COVID, we're going to look back at what is our plan for a pandemic? What did we do for this time when we found ourselves in this crisis? What did we do? Where could we have maybe been more effective? Where could we have been more efficient? What things didn't we think about that we had to create on the fly, which in this case was probably everything. But what things could we have so that next time we're not caught off guard and we have some things already ready? So definitely important to do it annually if it's something that you're not engaging with. If it's something you engage with, it needs to be assessed and evaluated immediately after the crisis ends. That way you don't forget anything. You don't have things that are out of sight, out of mind. It's still very top of mind.
Yeah. Awesome. Let's dig into that idea of kind of the team and who needs to be involved, right, in the planning process. And we've kind of mentioned it at various stages or various questions earlier, but let's talk more about that, kind of based on your experience, what you've seen, and how you maybe even have operated at Brenau.
Yeah, so generally in the planning process, you're going to have kind of a smaller team, right? Just the people who are specifically involved in various departments that may be affected by a crisis. So you'll always have your president, or if it's an organization, your CEO. You're going to have somebody at a level that can speak for the organization and make final decisions on that plan. So the president should be there. You'll generally have your head of public relations or communications. Often at most colleges, that's a vice president role. But you'll have that person because they've been trained in message strategy, right? So we can say, we want to tell everybody it's going to be okay. Okay, now how do we frame that? How do we present that? How do we add the right language to communicate that? You'll have any other vice presidents or department managers that might be affected. So at a college or a university, your vice president of academic affairs is really important. Most of these crises are going to affect the ability to provide education to your students. So the vice president of academic affairs needs to be there. How can we do this? How can we pivot if we have to go fully online? How can we pivot if we have to have a hybrid situation? So we need them. Some legal counsel. Again, the last thing you want to do is to put yourself in greater risk through things that you say or do in your response to a crisis. So you want to have things checked out by your legal counsel. Almost every crisis is going to involve the security of your institution in some way. So even COVID, for example, when we closed down campus, we had to make sure that people weren't trying to return to their office or to their dorm rooms, things like that. Security needs to be involved in those conversations to help come up with a plan to handle the security of the campus. Human resources, faculty and staff are always going to be affected. So how does this affect possible furloughs? How does this affect time off, paid time off or otherwise? So all of those things. Some other people that might be included in the planning process really are dependent on the crisis. And so depending on what crisis plan you're writing, you would involve other people. So for example, IT breaches are something that every organization right now talks about, has a plan for, has training for. And so when you're writing your crisis plan regarding technology breaches, obviously you're going to want to bring in your vice president of IT or somebody from your IT department. They know the things to look for where the president may not, right? If you're talking about a pandemic, if you're talking about other healthcare related issues, you're going to want to have health services involved. So you'll tweak outside of that core group depending on what the crisis may be. So that's going to be your core group. And then you may add or take people away depending on what that specific crisis is.
So Julie, when I look at this and we start talking about VPs over here, department chairs over here, or different folks, like I look at that and I immediately think, what's that saying? Like too many cooks in the kitchen? Like at some point, is there too many people involved? And how do you kind of manage that?
Yeah, so you really have to remember as well that there's a difference in the planning of your crisis management plan and the implementation, right? So your planning team might be pretty small, but your implementation group might then expand to a lot more people. And I'll give you an example. When we needed to communicate to our students through COVID, we wanted to make sure that we were keeping our students engaged, that we were keeping them encouraged. Right? A lot of institutions were faced with serious retention questions when we lost our students in March, and we may be able to bring them back in September. It's a long time to not have meaningful contact with your students. And so we sent every one of our students postcards from the faculty. And so faculty were then brought into the implementation of the plan to handwrite postcards to students. Now, we don't want our full faculty in the planning process, right? We can't split hairs over the plan, but we'll bring other people in to implement that plan effectively. The other thing that's really important with this group, this task force, is not just to have these titles on a page. You need to have the names, so who exactly the legal counsel is that we're going to use for this. What exact person from our human resources department, and you need to have several points of contact for them. Office numbers, cell phone numbers, email addresses, because unfortunately, most crises don't happen Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., right? If something happens at midnight on a Saturday, we've got to be able to get in touch and immediately enact this crisis plan. And so this list of who needs to be involved needs to be very specific and very detailed with contact information.
Yeah, I think that's a really important one. And the Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 is so very true, right? It seems like that it always happens at different times than what we'd expected, and unplanned events, right? So you had talked earlier about kind of scenarios. We've talked through that we can look at kind of what others have done or others have experienced, but let's talk about how do we anticipate unplanned events and how do we kind of plan for them? So help us kind of dig into that one a little bit.
So you always want to start with those events that you can anticipate. Like we talked about earlier, we can always anticipate a fire, a flood, a natural disaster. Unfortunately, now active shooters. We can always anticipate some medical outbreak, whether it's TB or something else on a campus. We can anticipate those. So we need to start with those. We also need to get into a habit of communicating with like organizations, right? So this is a wonderful forum because we have representation from a lot of institutions. And so we need to get in the habit of saying, Kari, this is what we've seen at our institution. Are there things that you've experienced at your institution that we're not thinking of, right? We don't want to be blindsided. What are some things that you've had? So having those conversations helps us to kind of broaden that group of crises that we can prepare for. Then we really need to engage in some critical and creative thinking, right? Some brainstorming. So these types of pandemic outbreaks, they have happened before. And even though it wasn't on our immediate horizon, we probably could have said it was a possibility, right? 9/11, people didn't necessarily, it wasn't top of mind, but people in the World Trade Center had a plan in place for how to evacuate that building in case something ever happened like that. So sometimes it takes some critical and creative thinking. What are those crazy things that probably won't happen but could? And so we can't imagine every single thing that's going to happen. So we need to imagine as many things as we can, right? We need to come up with as comprehensive list as we can. And then we can begin to triage them. What are things that are kind of that level 1 crisis that maybe it's just going to take an email to do some control for? What are those level 2 that might include a small number of stakeholders, maybe just our faculty? And then what are these major events that are going to affect everybody that need to have that comprehensive communication plan? And you know, a lot of scholars use the term black swan events, right? We need to be ready for black swan events. And that's what 2020 as a year has been. We're living in a black swan year. So it says unexpected occurrences that precipitate dramatic history-shaping impacts that are so disproportionately rare and generate disproportionately large impacts that people are generally blind to anticipating them. You know, right now, that's kind of what we're finding is that maybe we could have planned for a pandemic. Maybe we could have planned for social unrest. Maybe we could have planned for an economic downturn. But putting them all at the same time, right. Nobody would have ever planned that. And so the more things that we can have in place, the better we are situated to respond to those black swan events in a way that builds faith in the institution rather than makes people question the institution.
Right. Right. One of the things, and we get asked this quite frequently is do you have any kind of tips or tricks on trying to help the academy or the institution brainstorm and to be creative thinkers, right? And so do you have it, or have you ever run some scenarios or have anything that you've used to help kind of get those bigger ideas or those more random kind of sporadic things into the sphere of discussion?
Absolutely. And sometimes it's really just those creative thinking exercises. So maybe it's not everybody sit down and make a list of all the crazy crises you think could happen, right? Because we're blocked by what we know. We're blocked by what we've experienced. And so we do some things, we do webbing, right? So in the center of your page, you might write down crises. And then you may have medical crises, natural disasters, technology. And so it gets people to start thinking a little bit more specifically. And then you keep webbing down farther and farther and farther until you get to some things that you may not have thought of when we just said, list all the crises you can think of. Mm-hmm. So that's one. Free association, just again, to get the creative juices flowing. So Kari might start with an airplane crash. That'd be a terrible crisis. So then I have B, and I might say a botulism outbreak in the cafeteria, and then C. And so we go alphabet. So again, we're less constrained by just that, put something on paper, and we begin thinking in a different, more strategic way. Yeah. And then, like I said earlier, really forming some relationships with like organizations is a great way to start to broaden your library of things that you may not have ever thought about.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think it's so important to try and, again, anticipate, but also allow yourself to kind of go to some bizarre extremes, right? That get you thinking in different ways. Again, I love this quote: in any moment of crisis, the best thing you can do is the right thing. The next best thing is the wrong. And the worst you can do is nothing. And again, I think we have certainly heard that, seen that, felt that, that if you're doing nothing at all, you're creating the level of chaos and the opportunity for people to fill in the gap is pretty alarming and pretty traumatizing for particular institutions, right?
That's exactly right. People are looking for something within an hour of a crisis starting.
Right.
So you need to say something.
Yeah. So how do you ensure effective deployment of the plan? I mean, we've talked about how do we get there, what needs to be in there, who are the people, what's the stakeholders, what are the scenarios, but what do you do to make sure that you're really able to act on it with a level of confidence and impact? Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't get more simple than plan and practice, right? Plan, think through that plan, revisit that plan, and practice. This is the reason that even kindergartners engage in fire drills, right? We don't assume that when the fire happens, we can say, everybody get outside, and 500 5-year-olds are going to know what to do and how to do it in a way that is effective, efficient, and safe. And so we practice, right? So we know that as 5-year-olds that we need to practice the fire drill, and somehow along the way we forget that. And so it really is important to practice, to pull the plan off the shelf, dust it off, and practice it. It's the same reason that we do role playing, even in counseling and therapy, right? We need to see what it looks like when we actually do it. Talking about it is great, but what does it look like when we actually implement that plan? I play a lot of sports, right? And so we talk a lot about visualization, practicing and visualizing. So I could never step onto a tennis court, never practice, and think I'm going to win a match. I have to practice, and then I've got to visualize. What does it feel like when I make this shot? What does it sound like? What is the reaction from the other player? I need to think through all that. So I know it might sound oversimplified, but it really comes down to dusting it off and practicing what you've put into place.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think that's a really good point here. We in our K-12, right? We practice fire drills. We practice tornadoes. We all sorts of active shooters, as you mentioned, which is so sad. But this is a time where, again, in higher ed, I think we definitely need to practice, and we need to be very, very familiar with kind of the expectations, not only for our staff and employees, but also for students, so that they know how to kind of navigate around it, right?
Absolutely.
So how do you build into this continuous improvement? I mean, one of the things that I think we all love about higher education is that we're lifelong learners, right? We're constantly trying to make sure that we're improving and that we're changing and evolving and adapting and infusing kind of new thinking. How do we do that in crisis communication, and what does that look like?
Yeah, your crisis communication plan should be like anything else in the institution. It should be involved in a cycle of continuous quality improvement. So in the pre-crisis phase or stage of that crisis cycle, that's when you have to have a defined assessment metric. What are the questions that you are going to ask after the crisis is over to know if your plan has been successful? What are you going to look for? What are your elements of success or failure? That should all be defined in the pre-crisis stage. You should know that then. And you should use those predetermined metrics very clearly in the end to assess your success of that plan. However, it's often a good idea in the post-crisis phase, in addition to looking at those metrics and to your results, to bring in an outside party, a third party, to be a participant in the debrief. Right? So I can answer all the questions. I can have a Likert scale and say, on 1 to 5, this is how we feel in all these areas. But there's something that comes from the narrative, right? Bringing the team together and talking through the process, what felt right, what worked, what didn't work. And so during that debrief, there's a lot of pride of ownership of various parts of the plan. There's a lot of passion. After a crisis, right? We can look right now and see how everybody is a bit heightened because of their passion, their involvement, their stress levels. And so sometimes it's difficult to see everything clearly and unbiased. And so sometimes having that third party moderator for the debrief can be very, very effective in finding holes or problems with the crisis.
Yeah, I love that. I think that is a big one. And I think the good news is if you get to the end of a crisis and people have a level of passion and commitment to the plan, it means that I think you've done the right thing in building and creating the plan and creating that buy-in and kind of and having others be a part of it, which is awesome. Let's talk and let's kind of switch to lessons learned, right? And I think you and I talked a lot about this in terms of making sure that there's a level of relationship with within the institution, and then with the institution and the various stakeholders outside, right? And so I think this quote is a great one. You know, when it comes to crisis communication, if you always focus on building a relationship with your customers, fans, followers, you will always find yourself communicating in the right direction. And I think there is something to be said for making sure that we're mindful and intentional about how we do that and what that looks like. So let's talk through, again, kind of lessons learned, right? So this is one you and I had some good discussion around related to media training. And so why is that a big deal? Why should we care? That's not something we do on a day-to-day basis, but why is that really important in a crisis situation?
Absolutely. And I'll just give you a couple of quick points here. First, and probably the most important, is that your relationship with the media should not begin the day a crisis erupts. You should be building a relationship with your media outlets all year long, right? So that when a crisis occurs, you are in the best position to get information to them, for them to respond to you, and for them to help you position your message in a favorable way. So you need to think, and it goes back to the quote you just used, right? Relationships have to be in the foreground. Assuming you have that great relationship with the media, there's a couple of things that you need to do. Whoever that spokesperson is going to be should have some practice speaking in front of a camera, speaking into a microphone, thinking through how to respond to questions, right? Not that reporters would ever try and sensationalize a story, but you need to be aware of those things and look out for those things and think about how to position your statement in the best way for your organization. So there needs to be some practice and some training. Next, the media and our stakeholders are looking at us to tell it all and tell it fast, right? They want us to seem transparent and immediate. So we can't appear as though we're holding back information. And so we need to think about some terms that might give that impression. So things like no comment, right? No comment has become one of the most stigmatized statements. No comment is interpreted as you're guilty or you're trying to hide something. And so you need to be aware of that going into a press conference or your statement. And so it's okay to say, rather than no comment, I'm so sorry, we don't have all of the information yet. We are still gathering facts as quickly as we can. And as soon as we have that information, we are going to come back to you with it. But we don't want to be irresponsible and report anything that may not be accurate. You're then being very honest. It's okay to say you don't know, but then to tell them how you're going to find out, right? So that's a lot better. And then what are your key holding statements, right? And so a holding statement is just that placeholder, that boilerplate. If you don't have an information, what is a canned statement that you can say to buy yourself time? So for example, for Brenau, it might be, Brenau is an institution that for 142 years has had a mission of educating and empowering our community. So everything that we're doing during this crisis is going to ensure that we can continue to provide that service to our students, faculty, staff, whatever it is. What are those canned statements that you can say that will buy you a little bit of time? And those can be written years ahead of time, approved by your public relations office, approved by legal, and be ready to go.
Awesome. Yeah. Let's talk about lesson 2, intentional communication, right? What does that mean, and how does that kind of play into the world, and how does that play into kind of our overall approach with planning?
So there's really kind of 3 different forms of communication, right? Proactive communication, just-in-time communication, reactive communication. In an ideal world, everything that we ever said would be proactive. We would have anticipated it. We would have had a statement. We would be prepared. That would be the best case scenario. Our crisis management plan helps in that. It gives us some tools that we can pull out our toolbox when we need them. But there's always times where we have to pivot, right? And so sometimes we have that just-in-time communication. Those things that we have to do as new information comes up or as new circumstances evolve. So we can be prepared to the extent that we can be prepared, right? But we're going to have to pivot. We're going to have to tweak our message. And so here it's really important that we are very intentional and that we bring things back to the value proposition of our institution, that we're comfortable with what our institution stands for so that we can bring it back to those points. Here it's really important. It goes back to, it was reiterated in that survey I mentioned at the very beginning of our talk, what students said were the reasons that they felt so comfortable with the communication. They said it was empathetic, right? They felt that the institution empathized with their situation. It was transparent. It was immediate. It was honest. It was vulnerable. All of those things come into play when we talk about that just-in-time communication. Being honest with whatever information you have. Being transparent when you don't know the answer. And being okay to say, I don't know the answer just yet. So sorry. And then there's that reactive communication. This is the worst position that we can be in. We were completely blindsided. We didn't have anything prepared. And so we're now reacting after the fact to something that has happened. Here, always come back to those mission and value statements, right?
Right.
We did not anticipate this. We are doing everything in our power to get this under control, to bring this to resolution. As soon as information becomes available, we are going to share that with you, and we are going to get to the bottom of this in the quickest, most efficient, most effective way possible. And during this time, we're never going to deviate from the purpose of our institution or from the mission of our institution. So again, showing that empathy, and this is the time when you can be a little bit vulnerable, because again, that builds goodwill with your stakeholders, right? They're not trying to hide anything. They're not running away from it. They're tackling it, and they're going to be as honest and transparent as they can be.
Awesome. Well, let's talk about lesson 3 and the whole idea of practice, right? I mean, we've talked a lot about practice, right? And ultimately, some of this is just a game of chance, right? And so talk us through, thoughts there and or kind of tips, tricks, things that we might want to consider in the future.
Yeah, one thing that's really great about the practicing is that it allows you to get more people besides just your task force, just your team involved. So again, your task force might come up with a plan. What are we going to do if there's a fire? They're going to have that crisis plan. But when you actually implement that plan, it involves a lot more people. And so in the practice phase, you get to bring in a lot more of the stakeholders to run through the scenario so that everyone feels confident with what you're doing. So one thing, you can just simply run through a drill. And you can start with simple ones. So you can start with, what are we going to do if there's a fire? Right? What are we doing if there's an active shooter? Okay, we're going to hunker down, we're going to lock our door, we're going to, whatever it is. So you can run through some of those drills. Some things you can't necessarily run through the drill of. We're going to move all of our classes online. We're not going to ask all of our faculty at every stage to have every class online. There's some things that we can't do. But even in those cases, right, we know now that there's a chance that everybody has to move online. Start now training all of your faculty to be online instructors. At Brenau, every faculty member is required to go through a series of courses to certify them to teach online. Whether they teach on ground or online, it doesn't matter. We were prepared for this. We didn't know it was going to be because there was going to be a pandemic, but we had no problem shifting all of our classes online because our faculty were already ready. So look at those things that you can practice to the extent that you can. There's also a lot of really good virtual trainings. So again, things that you can't necessarily practice for, there are a lot of online trainings for them. What to do if you have a student that comes to you that is suicidal. Where do you refer them? What do you talk about? How do you mitigate that situation as quickly and safely as possible? What do you do if there's an active shooter? Where do you go? How do you hide? All those things can be done through virtual trainings as well. So those are good to look at. And you want to make sure that anyone that could be affected by the plan has at least enough knowledge that they don't impede the plan being implemented. So if somebody didn't know at all what we were going to do in a crisis, and the crisis situation comes up, we don't want somebody blocking the plan because they didn't know better. So we want to make sure there's enough practice that everyone can jump on board and help the ship go forward.
Right. Right. That's awesome. How about lesson 4, own your story, and kind of that whole conversation around the narrative and the communication. Talk to us a little bit more about that one.
Yeah, you want to be the first one out with your story. Anytime there's a vacuum of information, somebody's going to fill it. They might fill it internally, so what they believe about your organization, but they also might fill that story publicly on social media or talking with friends, things like that. So you want to make sure that you have filled in any gaps in the story. And you want to communicate early and then continue communicating often. So anytime there's new information, you need to share that. You need to share what you know and be honest about what you don't know. Because at least if I say I don't know it, somebody's not trying to fill it in. And a great example of that is with commencements, right? Everybody had this situation where commencements were canceled. We didn't know when they were going to be. And so rather than just leave that out in the open, we had a statement. Commencement's been canceled. We want to celebrate this milestone with all of you in a way that is safe for your friends and family members and faculty to join and honor you. We don't know when that day will be yet, but when we decide, when we have information that allows us to make that decision, you will get a message from the president's office or wherever it's coming from. So then they know where to look. If they hear a rumor, they can say, actually, I haven't gotten anything from that outlet you told me I was going to get it from, so I'm going to hold off, right? You have to be honest about what you know and what you don't know, and update.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's so, so important. And then the last one, and you touched on this a little bit, but I think it's a really important one, is kind of lesson 5, right? Live your brand. So how can your brand, or how can you leverage your brand or kind of share your brand in moments of crisis?
Yeah, so there's a great quote, and it says, any deep crisis is an opportunity to make your life extraordinary in some way, right? A crisis is really going to reveal the true nature of an organization, the true brand. And so we've got to make sure that we're responding and reacting in a way that is consistent with our value and mission propositions. And so we need to really think about that. We need to know what we stand for as an organization, and that should be apparent before, during, and after the crisis, right? If we're saying that we value our students, but all of our messages only talk about the money that we're going to lose from a lack of enrollment in the fall, that's not reinforcing that we value the students that we have, right?
Right.
We need to know what we stand for as an organization, and every message we send has got to support that statement at every stage of the crisis.
Right. That's awesome. So I'm looking at time. I think thank you, Julie, for all of this. It was great to have great to have you here. Thanks for letting me ask a bunch of questions, and I probably took us more over time than I needed to. So for that, I apologize to any of the participants. I think the one thing that I wanted to make sure we did we answer the questions? I think we got through them all, plus some extra ones. So again, thanks for indulging me on that. Sparky, any additional questions that you have? I've kind of been trying to pay attention to the Q&A, but if there are any additional questions that you have, again, I know we're mindful of time, please let us know. And I think Julie and I are happy to answer those.
We just have one just kind of slide in from Osman. It's a two-parter. First is, how is risk communication differentiated from crisis communications? And then the second part is, what crisis communication strategies are usually used by institutions? So let's tackle that first one. How is risk communication differentiated from crisis communication? Julie, how'd you answer that?
Yeah, so early in the slides, we talked about as you're planning your crisis communication plan, thinking about any consequences that could occur from the implementation of your plan. And so that goes into what risk communication is. In risk communication, you're really looking at mitigating consequences, whether that is a risk of belief in your organization, right? Faith in your organization, whether it's risk of litigation, whatever it might be, that's really risk management. Looking at those consequences and figuring out how to mitigate the consequences. When we're talking about crisis communication, we're really talking about how do we maintain the relationship with our stakeholders to keep their support throughout the crisis, right? How do we kind of navigate the storm alongside of our stakeholders? And so they really go hand in hand, right? Part of our communication strategy is how do we address situations so that we don't find ourselves in litigation? How do we get out ahead of a problem? How do we talk to our constituents in a way that might mitigate future discontent with our organization? So they really go hand in hand, but I look at crisis communication management more at what is our plan to communicate with and build a relationship with our constituents, and then risk, really looking at how do we mitigate the consequences or potential consequences from either the crisis or from our implementation of a plan.
All right. Excellent. And so obviously this whole topic has been about crisis communication. That second part of Osman's question, what strategies are usually used by institutions, just anything else in terms of whether a recap or just any other insight on what makes for a successful crisis communication strategy at the institutional level.
Yeah, I think the best advice is frequent communication on the platforms that our stakeholders use. And so, technology has been really a magical thing, especially during this time that we've been socially distanced. So we've had a lot of opportunities to use a lot of tools in the toolbox, whether it's video messages sent out through email, whether it is live webinars to discuss things, to have questions answered in real time, Twitter, letters, postcards. It's using a lot of communication methods, knowing who our stakeholders are and communicating with them frequently in the ways that they like to receive information. It's really the most important thing. And that's not just with a college or university, that's with any organization.
Absolutely. Awesome.
All right. Well, that covers the Q&A, Kari.
Awesome. I love it. Well, thanks again, Sparky. Do we want to give kind of any additional kind of thoughts in terms of kind of the new future website and things like that, resources?
Absolutely. And so just as a reminder, we have been recording today's webinar, and so it'll be posted on our Helix Education YouTube channel. It'll also be posted here, helixeducation.com/new-future. And in addition to our webinar, you will find lots of content related to this COVID roadmap to fall 2020 as we talk about the new future of higher education. We've established 4 pillars in that transition to quality online education. Today, we talked about student and parent expectation management, and you've been with us for the other webinars. You've seen those other pillars in action as well. For each of these pillars, we've created rubrics, how-to guides, professional development and training, foundational templates, benchmarks, and KPI documents to help your institution accelerate your transition to fall 2020 because it's coming up. We're almost at the end of June. It's amazing how fast time is flying. And if you have more questions or more of a follow-up on today's topics, you can take a screen grab of this or watch for it when we post the YouTube video. There's Kari and Juli's phone numbers and email addresses there to reach out for further follow-up. So once again, Kari, Juli, thank you so much for joining us today. Really great conversation, really great insight. Thanks to all of you for attending. We hope you continue to stay safe and have a pleasant rest of your day and week. Take care.
Awesome. Thank you. Bye-bye.